that practiced on a fife. He looked again and found it was a letter from his wife. At length I realize, he said, the bitterness of life. He thought he saw a buffalo upon the chimney-piece. He looked again and found it was his sister's husband's niece. Unless you leave this house, he said, I'll send for the police. He thought he saw a rattlesnake that questioned him in Greek. He looked again and found it was the middle of next week. The one thing I regret, he said, is that it cannot speak. He thought he saw a banker's clerk descending from the bus. He looked again and found it was a hippopotamus. If this should stay to dine, he said, there won't be much for us. He thought he saw a kangaroo that worked a coffee mill. He looked again and found it was a vegetable pill. Were I to swallow this, he said, I should be very ill. He thought he saw a coach and four that stood beside his bed. He looked again and found it was a bear without a head. Poor thing, he said, poor silly thing, it's waiting to be fed. He thought he saw an albatross that fluttered round the lamp. He looked again and found it was a penny postage stamp. You'd best be getting home, he said, the nights are very damp. He thought he saw a garden door that opened with a key. He looked again and found it was a double rule of 3. And all its mystery, he said, is clear as day to me. He thought he saw an argument that proved he was the Pope. He looked again and found it was a bar of mottled soap. A fact so dread, he faintly said, extinguishes all hope.
So, that's the Mad Gardener's song from Lewis Carroll, Charles Dodgson. It's taken from a book, Sylvie and Bruno, published in 2 parts. I think the book itself is not very famous. Most people don't know it. However, this comic poem from it is one of Lewis Carroll's better pieces of nonsense verse. It works in a similar kind of way to the way that Father William worked. It inverts logic, turns logic on its head. What we have to remember is that Lewis Carroll was a logician, a mathematician, a good one, a don at Cambridge University. He published mathematics textbooks. So most of his life was involved. Most of his life involved following logic, and he delighted in having these opportunities in his children's books to break the rules of logic. But it's not quite like anybody else breaking the rules of logic. For Lewis Carroll, he is someone who really is a very logical man, and his mathematical interests all based on logic, really. So what we often see is that he sets up a logical format and then goes out of his way to destroy all the connections between the parts. A lot of people know about the Aristotelian syllogism, where in 3 steps something is supposed to be proven. I don't know, all men are intelligent. Aristotle is a man. Therefore, Aristotle is intelligent. There has to be, although this is actually discredited as a means of discovering truth, it certainly has its internal logic. So Aristotle, all men are intelligent. Aristotle is a man. Therefore, Aristotle is intelligent. So from the first statement, the other 2 statements follow. There is a logical connection. So what Lewis Carroll really loves doing in these nonsense poems is setting up a logical structure like the syllogism. It's not a syllogism, but he enjoys setting up a logical structure that we expect to lead to a sequence of step-by-step logical results, and then destroying all the connections. So you have the form there, you have the format of the logical sequence, but there is no connection between the parts. So it's like as if you said Aristotle. It's like as if you said all men are intelligent. Aristotle is a chimpanzee. Aristotle. Say that again. It's like saying all men are intelligent. Aristotle is a chimpanzee. Therefore, Aristotle enjoys drinking beer. It has no kind of connection. So he delights in doing this. He delights in breaking the logical connection and giving us the opposite of what we expect. So in this poem, there is this sequence which is repeated through all the stanzas. It begins, I thought I saw something. I thought I saw a buffalo upon the chimney piece. And then you have, I looked again and found it was my sister's husband's niece. If you don't leave this house, I said, I'll send for the police. Now let's look at the way he actually destroys logic here and confounds all our expectations. So, I thought I saw a buffalo upon the chimney piece. Well, this is outrageous, of course, but it's a statement. And then I looked again and found it was. Well, what we naturally expect is that the first statement was so outrageous that he looked again and found it was some kind of hallucination, and we expect to hear that the second thing was more normal, but instead it's even more ridiculous. It morphs into his sister's husband's niece being on the mantelpiece, which perhaps is even more ridiculous. And then there is like a little conclusion at the end, which again has absolutely nothing to do with what went before. If you don't leave this house, he said, I'll send for the police. So, yeah, I mean, if the buffalo has changed into his sister's husband's niece, it's a very strange thing indeed, but presumably he knows who it is and has some kind of relationship with his sister's husband's niece. Why would he send for the police? So he's deliberately, of course, playing with our emotions and making us laugh. So we expect one thing. We are like the students in a classroom. We are given a logical sequence and we expect it to follow in a particular way, and instead there is no connection between the parts, and they're all totally and utterly outrageous and extremely funny. I thought I saw a coach and four that stood beside the bed. I looked again and found it was a bear without a head. Poor thing, he said, poor silly thing, it's waiting to be fed. Well, there is the same destruction of logic going on here as happens in all the stanzas of this poem. However, there's something extra illogical about this, because he saw a bear without a head, and then he says it's waiting to be fed. So how can a bear without a head be waiting to be fed? It's an extra level of absurdity. And similarly with the snake, I thought I saw a rattlesnake that questioned me in Greek. I looked again and found it was the middle of next week. The one thing I regret, he said, is that it doesn't speak. Sorry, I'm getting my pronouns mixed up sometimes. I don't have the poem in front of me, so I think that sometimes I'm saying I and sometimes he, but I'm sure that in the poem it's always he, in the third person. So again, the rattlesnake questioned him in Greek, and yet at the end, the one thing he regrets is that it couldn't speak. So totally absurd, and a delight for everybody, and particularly children who seem to really enjoy this kind of destruction of logical sequence, and one thing just morphing into another without any connection. I thought I saw an albatross. He thought he saw an albatross that fluttered round a lamp. He looked again and found it was a penny postage stamp. "You'd best be getting home," he said. "The nights are very damp." Again, a sort of weird connection, because the albatross has morphed into a penny postage stamp fluttering around the lamp, and the nights are damp, and so probably that would be dangerous for a penny postage stamp with a sticky back. So some connections made, but absolutely absurd connections, and that's why it's so funny, of course. So many English people or British people or English speaking people from all over the world have grown up with these nonsense poems, and they provided a way of getting to know the language better while having a good laugh. So Lewis Carroll is certainly to be thanked for that. And the last verse of the poem is possibly the most ridiculous of all. "I thought I saw an argument that proved I was the Pope." He thought he saw an argument that proved he was the Pope. He looked again and found it was a bar of mottled soap. "A fact so dread," he fondly said, "extinguishes all hope." So Carroll Dodgson, the logician, again thinking about logical sequence and logical arguments. So now he thinks he's come up with an argument that proves he's the Pope, or somebody has. And instead he looks again and finds it is a bar of mottled soap. "A fact so dread," he fondly said, "extinguishes all hope." So each of the stanzas are divided into these three parts, and the three parts really have nothing to do with each other, and they become progressively more absurd usually, and that's not what we expect. We would expect, after something fantastic, "I thought I saw something fantastic," we would expect, "He looked again and found it was something more reasonable," but it's always even more absurd, and then the final conclusion is usually not connected at all to anything that went before, or there is a connection that makes the whole thing even more ridiculous and ludicrous, like the rattlesnake that questioned him in Greek but couldn't speak, or the bear that stood beside his bed without a head and yet was waiting to be fed. So all of these things, if you talk about them too much, of course, you can destroy the humor in it. But it's worth analysing to see how clever it is, and how well Lewis Carroll, Charles Dodgson could write these nonsense poems, and probably somebody without his background in logic could never have done it so well. So I hope that this is useful, Thank you.